First of all, good luck with the museum plans. Museums are dear to my heart. This is the 50th anniversary for the New York Museum of Transportation, and I think I've been there for almost all of them, and at least it feels that way. And we invite you to come out any Sunday. But before I get into my spiel, you talking about clothespins. In my garage, I have an old house in the city. In my garage, there's a long pole, and up around here, there's a little metal clip on the top. Mm-hmm. Anybody have an idea what that might be?
It holds the clothesline up.
Right, so it supports the clothesline, because when you're hanging the bed sheets out there, they're heavy and wet, and they would drag in the ground. You'd be surprised how many people don't know the answer to that. Anyway, the Transportation Museum is in Rush. We have 1.5 miles of railroad track that we've built ourselves, and it has overhead trolley wire with 600-volt electricity in it. That's what Thomas Edison came up with, and that's what we still use. I have some brochures here for you. If you're interested, we're open Sundays and from 11 to 5 through October, and then we open up again for Christmas, some special things at Christmas time. I only have 4 of these, but one of the special treats, I say that because there aren't a lot of people who remember the subway and the interurban trolleys, but when you mention the Midtown Plaza monorail, oh my gosh, I remember that. So there's a couple brochures of that if you'd like. I promise to put more in my box next time. And of course, the all-important bright green, would you like to volunteer? Or be a member or something like that. So that's all here. Talking about transportation, and we are, I mentioned we've built a railroad, but we also have horse-drawn vehicles, highway vehicles, art-related artifacts, photographs, and the like, everything that has to do with land transportation. But tonight we're going to talk about the interurban era. And as the script will tell us, this was from about 1900 to the Depression. By the time the Depression hit, which of course knocked the pins out of a lot of companies, worse than that, the automobile had taken over what transportation needs were provided by the interurban. So it's a very short-lived era, but an important one in the development of our community. People, imagine if you lived in Canandaigua without the interurban trolleys. If you wanted to go to Rochester, you made a big deal out of it because there were only a couple trains a day, and they were smoky and noisy and dirty and clunked back and forth. And you'd get to Rochester and you'd have to time yourself because the next trip back out might have been 3 o'clock in the afternoon in order to get home in time for dinner. The interurbans, in fact the one I'm going to tell you about, ran hourly from 6 in the morning till about midnight, and it zipped right in from Pittsburgh and Canandaigua in that area. You could come in, go to the dentist, do your shopping, have lunch, I don't know what all, and still get home in time to fix dinner. So it was a real dramatic change. People could now live in Canandaigua and Victor and Pittsburgh and commute to their jobs downtown instead of living in the city. Anyway, there's a lot of impact on our lives from transportation. It's in everything we have and everything we do. I remember a little boy at one of the group tours, I said, can you think of anything that doesn't have transport? And he said, how about my baby sister? Well, I didn't want to get into that, but you know, the point is really everything involves transportation one way or another, including us getting here tonight. This presentation only takes about 20 minutes, and as I say, I like to talk extemporaneously. I'm sorry, but this is a script, so I'm going to have to read it. And I'll try to stay out of everybody's way so that you can see the slides. And afterwards, we can have questions if you have any. So let's get this going. I gave this talk at Strong Museum several years ago, and I asked if there were any questions at the end of the program. A woman came up to me with her little boy and she said, he wants to know how this works. Talk about your clothespin, right? Everybody see that all right? Good. All right, at the dawn of the 20th century, half of the population of the United States lived in rural agrarian society. Life on farms or even in small villages was one of isolation, as travel was restricted by motive power and seasonal road conditions. Communities that were fortunate enough to have railroad service prospered through their connection with the culture and commerce of large cities. But for many small towns, rail passenger service was infrequent and expensive. Also, small businessmen and farmers in those towns often were not satisfied in their need to ship and receive in small lots at reasonable freight rates. I might need a little more light than that. I know it's hard to see with the lights on. Yeah, how about over in this side?
Open the window shade over there.
I was thinking about that.
We can do that.
Okay, that's good. Now turn them off in the back.
Turn them off in the front.
No, you can't see.
Can't have lights on
Yeah,
the
but-
front.
You can't see in front.
They spoil,
That's fine. That's fine. That's good. All right. Well, the time was ripe. The time was ripe for the coming of the interurban. Following this, interurban, by the way, is Latin for between cities. We all knew that. Following the success of the electric streetcar in large cities during the 1890s, investors and entrepreneurs took up the trolley technology and began financing the construction of rural lines. These electric trolley lines connected small outlying towns to the larger industrial cities, hence the name interurban, between cities. And this map is interesting. The first couple times I looked at this, I didn't know what I was looking at. It's actually Ohio and Indiana. Those are just electric trolley lines connecting cities in Ohio and Indiana. And I've seen a separate map that shows New York State out to Chicago. You could almost go from Maine to Iowa all by interurban trolleys. You know, I don't know what would possess you to do that. You'd be getting off of one and getting on another, but they were all interconnected. It was the .com of 100 years ago. People were throwing money into this idea. Equipment on these interurban lines was larger, heavier, and faster than the typical local streetcar. The early success of the interurbans was based upon the fast, inexpensive, dependable, and frequent service that they brought to the short and medium distance transportation market, thus giving the communities that they served a new freedom and mobility. Rochester, like many cities in the Northeast and Midwest, became a hub for radiating interurban lines. Of the 4 routes that served our city, we will focus on one which stands as a classic example of the era. And as the map shows, there's Rochester. You could go to Syracuse and beyond, or over to Buffalo, off to Geneva, which we'll talk about tonight, down to Mount Morris, up to Sodus. These were all electric trolley lines that went 50 miles an hour. That's the R&E schedule, by the way. I mentioned 5 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. The Rochester and Eastern Rapid Railway was incorporated in October 1901 to build an electric trolley line connecting Rochester and Geneva by way of Canandaigua. Construction began in Canandaigua in 1902 from the north end of the local streetcar line and reached Victor in October of that year. Rochester was reached in November 1903, entering the city via the Monroe Avenue streetcar line. Service began between Rochester and Canandaigua on November 15th. At the time, a branch line from Pittsford to Fairport was originally planned, and some track was laid, but the line was never completed. You notice that little piece of red stuff there from Pittsford to Fairport. As I understand it, the problem was they were trying to compete with the Rochester and Syracuse, which went to Syracuse. They're trying to tap the Fairport commuter market, and the Rochester and Syracuse didn't think too kindly of that. So here's the Rochester and Eastern laying rail into Pittsburgh during the day, and at night, the Rochester and Syracuse guys would come in and rip it all out. That's the way life was back then, I guess. Construction continued east from Canandaigua, and Geneva was connected to the system. Regular service through service began with this inaugural run on June 16th, 1904. And from this scene, it appears that at least at this time in our history, a woman's place was still in the home, because they're all guys, and they've all got hats on. You gotta have a hat back in those days. 15 stylish all-wood cars built by the John Stevenson Company provided hourly departures from each terminus on the Rochester and Eastern. Twice a day, express freight service provided by freight motors like this one handled shipments of farm produce and merchandise, and the legendary New York State winter snows were tackled by large electric snowblowers invented by Rochesterian George Ruggles. Interesting story. Captain Ruggles, they called him. When he was a 16-year-old boy, he ran away from home and ended up working on lake boats and graduated to captain and made the transition from sail to steam. And when he retired to Charlotte, he was getting tired of the little dinky streetcars of the time, not being able to get through the snowdrifts that you used to have in Rochester back then, up there at Charlotte. So he decided to put a propeller, one of the types of propellers that the boats used that he was familiar with, and he mounted it on one end of a streetcar, and it worked great. It blew the snow right off the tracks. He ended up licensing his ideas, his patents, to a company that built something like 60 of these and sold them to trolley lines in snow belts all around the country. Kind of interesting. You know, Rochester's famous for a lot of people doing interesting things that we never hear about, and that's one of them. Let us now use our imagination and step back in time to about 1920, the peak period in the life of the Interurban Era. We will take a picture trip from Rochester to Geneva on the Rochester and Eastern Division of the New York State Railways and get an idea of what a real trip was probably like. New York State Railways was a subsidiary of New York Central Railroad, and just like the airlines used to do with feeder lines, shorter airlines that would feed into the hubs so that you could take a longer trip. That was the New York Central's idea, so they bought up a lot of the local streetcar lines and interurban lines back in the 20s. The car we'll be riding weighs 35.5 tons and can reach 60 miles an hour. It's a classic example of the art of interurban car construction, truly a piece of rolling architecture. We purchased our tickets at the ticket office and waiting room on the northeast corner of Court and Exchange Streets, a facility that the R&E shares with the Rochester and Sodus Bay interurban line. We hurry out and are helped aboard by the conductor. This, of course, now is the Blue Cross War Memorial. Let's see, I always lose my place when I stop to talk about things like that. We hurry out, and the interior of the car is handsomely fitted with rich-looking varnished mahogany woodwork, brass parcel racks and hardware, and leather seats. The car will seat 50 people, and due to the length of the trip on this line, it's equipped with toilets and water coolers. For the men who smoke or chew tobacco, a separate section is provided at the front of the car. We take a seat, and in a few minutes, the conductor signals the motorman that it's time to depart. Our journey begins with the car backing down Exchange Street as part of a turning maneuver as a Sodus Bay car arrives to unload at the terminal. That's our car coming around, backing that way, and the Sodus car is heading away from us. After clearing the switch, our car then heads in the forward direction, turning onto Court Street and immediately passing the Erie Railroad train station. It's here that the two other interurban lines that serve Rochester share station facilities with the Erie Railroad. We then cross the Genesee River. From its great waterfalls, energy was tapped to power the early mills that gradually turned Rochester into a prosperous industrial city. On the east side of the river, we pass the Lehigh Valley Railroad Station, and it's often said how convenient it is, easy it is to travel by public transportation. So convenient to arrive and depart so close to downtown. When you think about it, you had all these train stations in Rochester. The B&O was Nick Tahoe's today, and the New York Central, Lehigh Valley, Erie, all this. And they were all interconnected by streetcar system. It was so convenient. You know, if you missed one streetcar, there was another coming right behind it. And oh my goodness, though, look at, what is that red thing down in the corner? Old early jalopy, early Packard probably. I don't know if that tells us something, but eventually Lehigh Valley left us, and that's now the Dinosaur Barbecue. Well, after 2 blocks, the car turned south on Clinton Street, and we passed the lovely landscape green of Washington Square, with its Soldiers and Sailors Monument. We soon turned southeast to proceed out Monroe Avenue, and just east of Goodman Street, a young boy gazes longingly at one of the big cars as it comes in from Geneva. Perhaps he's wishing he were old enough to be a motorman. And back in those days, that was quite a job to have. If you were a motorman or conductor, you had a uniform, you got good pay, it was a modern technology, and you got to help the young ladies up and down the steps of the trolley. You know, not a bad deal altogether. I live out in that area, no trolleys now. As Highland Avenue is the end of the Monroe Avenue streetcar line, here we see a 600 series city streetcar waiting on the turning loop before beginning its trek back through the city. Behind the car, believe it or not, is Cobb's Hill Park, a pleasant green oasis for Sunday picnickers. All those trees have grown up and they're huge now, and of course the reservoir is back there someplace. It's a great place, and they still have a bus turnaround there. Until this point, we have been riding on the city streetcar tracks. As we cross Highland Avenue, we find ourselves on private trackage of the R&E, a single track side of the road operation with passing sidings. Now I want you to see that about in the middle of the picture, there's a big telephone pole, and there's that lump on the side of it. You can see that? Well, that was a box with a door on it, and inside was a great big switch. And the last car in at night, the motorman would pull up to that box, open the door, and throw the switch and kill all the power behind him, so the farmers and other people couldn't throw a wire over the thing and run their milking machines or whatever they were going to do. Well, that thing was up there for the longest time, and a man I worked with at Kodak when he was a teenager was a fan of the trolleys. He went out there with an extension ladder, climbed up, and removed that. By this time, it was just, you know, the trolley lines were long since gone. He removed the box, and he gave it to me at the museum, so it's now on the wall at our museum. And well, you know, the switch is still in it. Every morning when I open the place, I open that box so that people can see the switch inside. Before the day is over, someone has closed it and put the hook on it. Oh my gosh, I don't want my child to get electrocuted. It's not connected to anything. What are they thinking, you know? Anyway, that's a little side note. All sorts of side notes here, I'm afraid. Our car picks up speed, passing the brick factories out here. You've heard of, that's the Cobb Mansion, by the way, named for Cobb's Hill. Well, Cobb made all his money making bricks. A lot of the houses in Rochester were made from bricks with mud that was pulled out of ditches out here in Brighton, which are now all nice homes. Anyway, we soon arrive at 12 Corners, and this is a busy stop when there's a baseball game at the adjacent Sheehan's Field. Farther along Monroe Avenue at Rowland's Farm, the track veers off to the east. Climbing a slight grade, it crosses over an abandoned portion of the Erie Canal. Until last year, a scene such as this would have been very common. But now the canal has been drained to prepare for the new subway construction slated to begin soon. And I'm not sure, but I think I gave the slide talk to you folks a few years ago. I'd be glad to come back and do that. It's fascinating. And of course, we all know the Erie Canal was rerouted out of the city, and they decided, what are we going to do with this ditch? So they put a subway in it. That's a remarkable story. The track arcs back to follow Monroe Avenue again, and after passing French Road, the line turns east again for a fast, that house is still there, by the way, for a fast sprint on a straight stretch that takes us under the Auburn branch of the New York Central Railroad, west of Pittsburgh. As we enter the outskirts of the village, we pass the Foreman's Pickle Factory, a busy enterprise in the summer months, and shortly after turning onto North Main Street, we duck under the west shore line again of the New York Central and turn abruptly into our first major stop, Pittsburgh. Now, that's the Pittsburgh station. The building in back, the taller building, was a substation where they converted purchased power to the 600 volt needed for the trolley. And parts of that building, I think, are still there. At least I used to say that. The station's gone. At one time, I used to make a marginal note about what's there now. It's changed so many times, I've lost track. I think the Pittsford Pub is back there someplace. And by the way, if you ever come down East Avenue into Pittsford, just before you go under the railroad tracks, when the intersection where Washington Street goes out to East Rochester, you might notice that on your right, as you're going towards Pittsford, there's a little extra space between the houses. That's where the trolley used to come in, and it got onto Main Street and underneath the railroad, and then veered to the left to stop at this station. Okay, now where was I? Let's see, okay. This is a combination station and substation. The substation converts, as I mentioned, converts the alternating current produced at the power plant into the 600-volt direct current to power the trolleys through the overhead wire. There is an exchange of parcels and passengers here before the conductor signals to proceed, and we accelerate quickly and pass through open farmlands before slowing to cross Palmyra Road as the motorman blows the air whistle. If you ever visit anyone at the Highlands, you might notice there's a nice little row of flowers and shrubs. That's where the line used to go. Soon we cross the barge canal, as it is now called, on a substantial truss bridge. Down the other side, our car clips along the side of the Rochester-Victor Road before it turns off onto a long fill that cuts through the hills in this area. The fresh air and scenery are a pleasure to experience. And it's worth remembering that most people lived in the city. If you've seen old pictures of Rochester or newsreels of Rochester, the smog and the smoke was everywhere. So, I mean, it was really a treat to get out on a trolley and take a ride and breathe the fresh air. The motorman is soon slowing for fishers. The line was built to the east of the village so it could have a faster route, and with only one person getting off here, we make only a brief stop. The motorman gets the car up to speed again, and we are racing along on the private right-of-way. It's one of the benefits of the electric traction power. Cars could stop quickly, they could also accelerate quickly, so you could have more frequent stops and yet not really hurt the performance of the train. We slow somewhat before crossing Swamp Road and its small flag stop shanty. For a stretch of 4 miles here, the Rochester and Eastern parallels the Auburn branch of the New York Central, and it was here in 1905 that the R&E gained national fame when it won a race with a steam train. Well, proving the superiority of clean electric power and perhaps proving the value of publicity. Some people tell me that this is actually a composite of 2 different photographs. It looks pretty real to me, but you never know. Anyway, we cruise along the racetrack before slowing to ease our way into the town of Victor, and passengers disembark here, others board, while the motorman receives a message to look out for the line car working up ahead. We must wait here for the westbound express car, but we are soon on our way again. This was a Victor library for a while. From Victor, the R&E cuts across open fields following the contours of the land, arcing its way southeast to Canandaigua. Occasional stops are made at the shanties and located at road crossings, but with the increasing popularity of automobiles, business at these smaller stops is decreasing. There's another early car. This picture doesn't really do justice to it, but a lot of the track was built either on one side or the other of early roads. Convinced this farmer to put the tracks over here. The next farmer doesn't want it, so the tracks went over to the other side. Well, the problem is the tracks went on a very mild angle, and the trolleys were going very fast. And I gave this talk to somebody years ago, and he came up to me afterwards. He says, my little sister got killed that way. Dad had a Model T Ford. He got to the crossing, one of those mild crossings. He says he actually turned the car off and got out and looked both ways. By the time he got back in and got the car started and off he went, bang. So times were tough back then, believe me. So this picture is a little bit different. I think you could get a good view either direction if the train was coming. The motorman slows the car considerably as we enter the main street in Canandaigua for the stretch through the city. Coming south on Main Street, we're followed by the local streetcar that runs from the orphan's home to the wharf. Our car crosses the New York Central's Auburn branch and we stop at Niagara Street. The station here is of the storefront type, and this is quite a busy stop on the line. There's a flurry of activity as we exchange passengers, baggage, and some express parcels. Transferring to the local car line, passengers can connect at the wharf with the steamship Onolinda for lakeside destinations. And within a few minutes, we're off again, turning east onto Phelps Street to leave town. But before we leave, years ago, two elderly ladies came to the museum. They were sisters, and their parents had a place on Canandaigua Lake. And just as happens today, only not with trolley cars and boats, Dad would stay in the city at the house and do his, going back and forth to work. Friday evening, he would take the R&E out to Canandaigua, get on the boat, and get off at their cottage, where they have a cottage on the lake. And the boat, of course, would bring the mail during the week. They could get groceries, all kinds of stuff. It was really quite a life. But that's the Onolinda right there, the nice old boat. Just east of the Pennsylvania Railroad, we pass a Rochester-bound car waiting for us at Palmer's Siding. Here we can see two of the many signals installed on the R&E in 1914, made by the General Railway Signal Company. Another big story of Rochester history as far as I'm concerned. These signals permit faster travel time and greater safety than in earlier years. Farther along, we pass Algerine, or is it Algerine? I'm not sure. A typical rural crossroad flag stop in the pretty but sparsely populated area east of Canandaigua. Upon entering the town of Seneca Castle, we cross over a creek where youngsters come to swim and get a thrill being under the bridge as the big trolley cars roll overhead. And as I like to point out, if you recall, the car is equipped with a toilet. They might get more than a thrill, I tell you. That's a terrible thing to say. Right? In a few moments, we coast into Seneca Castle, and with business quickly attended to, we are soon off again, flying alongside County Road 4. Through here, the motorman really opens up the throttle, and with the hiss of the trolley pole on the overhead wire, the rapid clickety-clack of the rail joints, and the air whistle blasting at the crossings, we can easily feel the potential of the Interurban. Within minutes, we pause at Gates. It's another one of these combination station and substation. The agent hops on to return to Geneva after his trick is over, and more high-speed running is in store as we race along the highway's edge. Before long, we're entering the outskirts of Geneva. Our car turns onto Castle Street, and we pass the Agricultural Experimental Station, where developments in horticulture keep New York State in the forefront in the nursery stock business. The big R&E car trundles down the length of tree-lined Castle Street past comfortable homes with well-kept lawns. Our 1 hour and 45 minutes since our trip began, we roll to a stop in prosperous and bustling downtown Geneva, just short of Exchange Street. For those continuing on to Seneca Falls or Waterloo, the connecting interurban car is waiting on Exchange Street. Others can catch the local car for points within the city or take it to the Lehigh Valley Station to continue a journey to the southeast. After our car has emptied, it turns around on the Y that is built into one of the retail buildings on the south side, on the north side of the street. You can't really see it there, but in this next picture, here it waits until it is needed for its next run. Kind of cozy, it backs right into that little slot and waits there. As there are hourly departures on the R&E, passengers are already arriving, ready to board for the next trip to Rochester. Service is available 18 hours a day all year long. Well, by the mid-1920s, the automobile had proven itself useful and reliable, and so had become firmly entrenched in American society. And it looks like American society was firmly entrenched in the automobile too. It looks like a traffic jam going on. Reduced cost from assembly line production coupled with the prosperity of the decade brought the automobile within the economic reach of more and more people. Look at the prices there. $680 for a little coupe. That's a pretty good deal. With street scenes such as this view in Geneva, it was obvious that the local trolleys' days were numbered in smaller towns. And in fact, this line in Geneva gave up in 1925. In an attempt to lure passengers back to the R&E and as a safety factor, prompted by the increased auto traffic and accidents at grade crossings, the R&E in 1924 repainted its cars in the bright yellow and cream paint scheme. But the new look failed to slow the rate at which riders were abandoning the interurban in favor of the automobile. The death blow came in October 1929 with the collapse of the stock market and the onset of the Depression. The R&E was forced to stop operation due to heavy losses. Late on the night of July 31st, 1930, the final trip from Geneva to Rochester was made with little fanfare. Here we see the last train terminating its run at the City Hall subway station, and thus ended the life of the Rochester and Eastern. Well, a few of the once graceful interurban cars were bought at auction, and they were used on farms as storage sheds and chicken coops. But sadly, the majority were destroyed at the Blossoms Road storage yard. But one of the cars auctioned was car number 157. The original 157 had been destroyed in a fire, and New York State Railways had bought this car from the Niles Car Company in 1914 to replace it. This replacement car featured a new type of construction which reduced its weight. This made the car faster, and it was considered the most popular car on the line. Records show that 157 was the only copy of this interurban car ever built. Fortunately, 157 was purchased by the Reverend Louis Edelman, a priest from the St. Louis Church in Pittsford. He moved the car to Stony Point on Irondequoit Bay and turned it into a cottage, which was used until his death in 1964. In June of 1970, just a breath away from being destroyed, 157 was saved and moved to the McGee Transportation Museum in Pennsylvania, where it was repainted and put on display for 3 years. In fact, the sad story is that a man who owned a carpet manufacturing company had created a private museum. He was wealthy. When he was a boy, he fell in a baseball game and broke his back. Was given a choice of either being like this forever, seated, or like this forever, standing. He chose standing, and he had a Rolls Royce, especially equipped with a kind of a sloping seat, so he could get in and lie in the car and drive around his wonderful museum. It was a beautiful place. Had trolley cars, antique vehicles of all kinds. Well, Hurricane Agnes in '72 destroyed the museum, and as a result, that car was homeless. Well, if I can find my place again, the New York Museum of Transportation acquired 157 as part of its collection when the museum was initially formed, and that was back in '72, '73. Well, with the final touches made, the restoration of one side and the front of 157 is now complete. Now we face the much more expensive and time-consuming task to actually get 157 running again. The museum feels that through community support, its total restoration and operation would allow future generations to experience the short-lived but colorful chapter in the history of American transportation known as the Interurban Era. And that's the spiel with a little hook on the end. The car really looks beautiful. It's our crown jewel as far as the quality of our collection. And it shows people how beautiful these cars were, how luxurious. Another one of our cars is the one that was in the Spaghetti Warehouse restaurant. If anybody ever ate there? Okay, well, you might have even sat in the trolley. Well, when they closed the restaurant in '96, there was an auction, and the fellow that owned the building wanted me to take the trolley at the auction. I didn't do that. What am I going to do with I end up with a trolley in your building? He ended up buying it himself, and he came over to me with his ticket and says, "Here, get it out of here, you can have it." So you win that one, you know, if you wait long enough. And so we had Matthews House Movers, CP Ward, and Silk Road, an Artport company that's business is transporting big heavy loads. And we got it out of, and I shouldn't fail to mention the Bricklayers Union. They do a pro bono for nonprofits, one project each year, and they hadn't done one yet in June. And the building had Medina stone walls, you know, and a big window. So they took the stones out, numbered everything, knew exactly where everything went, and that was an apprentice project. So in a way, we helped the bricklayers, and they helped us, of course. That's that car is completely remodeled or restored inside, and you can see how wonderful these cars were back then. Stained glass and beveled glass mirrors and all kinds of nice stuff. Well, that's the story about the R&E. Are there any questions or comments or complaints? Turn the lamp off. Yes, ma'am.
I noticed in some pictures one track and then in others two tracks.
Yeah.
I'm concerned about the one that just had one track. Was there designated when you went from Rochester to Canandaigua that would only be that direction, and then coming back it would be on a different track?
Well, when you saw a picture, the question, if you all heard it, she was wondering about a single track line. Basically, what do you do to avoid a head-on collision? When you saw a double track, those were long passing sidings, sometimes a couple miles long, and they were scheduled so that your trip going, say, to Geneva would veer off at one of these sidings, and it was scheduled so that the other guy coming the other way came through at the same time. In fact, it's very clever. The switch, you know, like everybody's had a model train, you know what a switch is. Those were spring switches. So they were always set for the divergence, but if a train came on the other side, the wheels of the train would just hit the switch and it would spring over, and so they didn't even have to stop. So you could be coming with your train to Geneva, and you come off the side, and here comes Joe. Hey, Joe, and Joe just goes flying right by, and you didn't even have to slow down. You just kept on going. So they had several of those, and you know, that sort of, with the hourly schedules, they only had a couple places where they had to be concerned about that.
In the wintertime with all the snow,
Yeah.
did they have difficulty? Did they have, I mean,
Well, they had one of those rotary plows that I showed you.
not
Cap-
on every, not on
Well, George Ruggles, the fellow that invented, Captain Ruggles, that invented the snow plow, they had one of those, and they had regular plows too. And also at our museum, we have a streetcar that has a big rotating broom. We'll do it this way. And just like the things you've seen today that go down sidewalks, these blew the snow off the city streetcar tracks, because that was part of their job. So there were ways to deal with the snow, although snow was a lot more deeper and harder to deal with.
How much did it cost to go from Rochester to Geneva?
People always ask me that, and I really don't know. It wasn't cheap, but you know, relatively. But
Yeah.
back then, streetcar tickets were a nickel, so I can't imagine it was more than 40 or 50 cents, maybe, something in that order. Yes.
In the 1970s, I was a member of the Airport Conservation Board,
Okay.
and we went. Actually, it was the guy who was chairman of that committee, and I went out to a little town of Egypt on Route 31.
Yep.
And there was a place where the streetcar actually crossed the road at that
You
place.
could see it. Yeah, you could see it.
Yeah, and there was a lady living in the house right next to where the line had been, and she had actually ridden the car as a young girl.
There you go.
And I think she was about the last one in the area who had actual experience in riding that.
That's something I observe as I get older myself. We've run out of people who rode the interurbans, and now we're starting to run out of people who rode the streetcar, because those quit in '41, the last ones. The subway lasted till 56, so we still got that going for it. That line was the line to Syracuse. That was a different line from this one, but they had good service on that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the 1940s, I guess, during World War II, my mother and I rode an Interurban in Denver.
Okay. Yep.
And the Interurban went up to the little town of Golden.
Oh, okay.
And there weren't many cars, and people didn't have gasoline, and so on Sundays we would ride the Interurban up to Golden and have Sunday dinner, and the only place to have it was in the hotel, because there weren't other restaurants. There was a restaurant and a hotel, so we had Sunday dinner.
It's interesting, the point you make that during the war with rationing of everything, here in Rochester, with great brilliance, we finally got rid of our last streetcar line in March of 1941. And what happened in December, you know, the war starts. So we wished we had kept the trolley lines, but that's the way it goes. Yeah?
You said the Interurban was owned by the New York Central? So the people that worked on the Interurban were employees of New York Central?
No, they were employees of New York State Railways, which was a subsidiary or a company owned by the railroad. Yeah.
Okay, and just women were, you know, there were no female drivers and
No female conductors or motormen.
okay.
Women were often ticket agents. And sometimes, you know, assistants to the supervisor, so they'd get on the handcar and go out and deliver a notice to a foreman or a paycheck or something like that. But mostly men. Yeah.
You mentioned, but who was the manufacturer of the Interurban cars and where were they made?
Well, that last one was Niles Car Company in Niles, Ohio. Kuhlman was probably the biggest manufacturer. They were in Philadelphia, and they made streetcars, and they sold them around the world. We've got the wheel assemblies with the motors there. It's called a truck. There's 2 trucks on a trolley. We have 3 sets of trucks from Japan that were made in Philadelphia. They're surprising. You know, you hear about the Japanese National Railway System, which oddly enough has a 3.5-foot gauge, but there were a lot of private electric railways, small ones, family owned, and they were standard gauge, the same as we use here in this country. And they bought the equipment from Kuhlman, from Philadelphia, and now, well, the last 25 years or so, they've been gradually buying new stuff, and the old stuff, rather than scrap it, we raise our hand, and we've got friends over there, and of course, we have to pay to ship the stuff and everything, but it's wonderful to find, and it's, of course, it's maintained still fairly well, as you can imagine, with the Japanese. Those are the 2 major ones. There were others, though. St. Louis Car Company built the car that's in the Spaghetti Warehouse restaurant. That was St. Louis. Yep.
what events would happen that there would be no electricity?
Cars would stop.
No,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
you talked about the power plants.
Yeah. There were power plants along the line,
Right.
and with steam engines that generated electricity.
So if something happened there, it would affect the whole line?
Well, they had enough of them. I suppose you could link them together, but the problem was that the voltage on the line drops dramatically with distance. Even with the power plants located, 4 or 5 of them along the railroad, you would be hard pressed to really get the voltage up. But at least you could keep it going and then make the repairs. But generally they were pretty reliable. Probably the biggest concern would be ice on the wire. I had a friend who lived in a house in Richard Street in Rochester overlooking the Rochester subway. And he said it was really neat. He'd lie there at night when in an ice storm, the trolley would come, the subway would come along, and as the pole bounced on the icy wire, it would spark. And he just blue sparks, so it was like a light show.
How long did the subway run?
What? I'm sorry?
How long did the subway actually run?
One more time?
How long the subway
How long did the subway last? It started in late 20s, different parts of it. By 1929, it was all together, just in time for the stock market crash, and it lasted until 56 for passengers. Parts of it served freight for a few more years.
I used to ride that.
Did you?
When I first came from Germany, there was still the subway.
A lot of people remember the subway. A lot of people remember being taken on the subway when they were a little boy or girl about 2 weeks before it quit. You know, we could only keep the business going, but well, you've been a great audience, and I appreciate your forbearance as I struggle with my script. But please come and visit us. As I say, I've got folders here for all that other stuff we talked about, and maybe Garth can arrange a group tour for you sometime. Thank you very much. Thank you.